Hi, welcome to One Degree Shifts. I'm your host, Pascal. I'm the co-founder of Nectar, and I'm super excited about this conversation. We're talking to Bettina Rothe today. She's an embodied leadership coach, a conscious movement facilitator, and a community builder based in my home province-ish of British Columbia, Canada. Hi, Bettina.
Hi, welcome. Thanks so much for having me here today.
Yeah, I'm very excited about this because movement and embodiment is a topic that's dear to me because it's been such a present thing for me in the last years around my own personal journey of healing. I came from a place of huge disconnection with my body, and over time, it's just been more deepening and experiencing more and more of the power of connecting to our bodies, and embodiment has been a huge trajectory for me of continuous seeking and exploring what that means for me in my life. And on your website, and I really like your website, it says a path of return into wholeness of body, mind, heart, and spirit. What do you mean by wholeness?
Well, exactly what you said. The embodiment part is so big, right? It's like that understanding that we can only become whole if we're actually living fully in our bodies. And I was
Mm.
on a call earlier, actually, where somebody was talking about our 9 different bodies, from really our densest physical part all the way to our energy bodies. And I believe that that integration and interweaving of those bodies is what creates that feeling of wholeness and also of alignment, so that my emotional body and my mental body, which are the ones that we use the most, actually move with our physicality, so that we're not moving against ourselves or moving only from a small part of ourselves. And the idea of calling spirit back in the body, because you brought the word spirit in as well, I think really means that consciousness lives inside of ourselves, and that our path of awakening and connection with spirit doesn't happen somewhere out there, but it happens inside of ourselves. And that in itself is, I think, a wound of disconnection that a lot of us.
Mm. Yeah, on our website, you mentioned the reconnection. That a big part of your work is about reconnection to our body, others, and the web of life through movement. And I really like that. And I like that you bring up the topic of 9 bodies. Can you explain a bit more of the relationship between the physical body, which is what most people think about when we say body, and all those different bodies? Like, how did they interconnect and play together, really?
Yeah, well, I was a student on that call, so I'm not going to comment on that body of work specifically, because I started taking notes and I was like, "Ooh, I want to investigate that further." But maybe I'll just talk about the bodies that I work with and the circles of inclusion work. I think the first one is Earth body, is that recognition that we're part of the earth, we're not separate from her. And so that wounding of uprooting, is often the first one that people feel when we ask them to connect to their physical bodies. And just the simple act of feeling the earth below and using her as an anchor and as a resource and as that primary relationship, that while we're in an earth body, we're always going to be here unless we're turning into astronauts. I was like, that is our primary relationship. And then that connects us directly to our physical bodies. And I differentiate between kind of the external of the body, which a lot of us refer to, how do I look? How's my hair? Good posture, and the inner experience of the body. So you could say, yeah, I know we always sit back right up, right, when someone says posture. And that's a good thing. It's like bringing that awareness to our vessels. But I'm really interested is, how do you inhabit your vessel? And can your awareness touch the inside of your body? And that is the inner body. And that's the magic zone, where the emotional and mental and energy bodies, they interweave. And we can create a lot of change by working with our physical body. And that includes, the shifting of posture. It includes our awareness of breath, but it has a lot to do with how I'm willing to inhabit, or use the word embody, myself. And when I first started, nobody knew what embodiment even was. It was like
Mm.
this weird term. It's like, what do you mean? And now, I love seeing there's conferences, there's podcasts, there's all these things, there's leadership development and therapy. We're talking about embodiment. But really,
Mm.
what that means to me is that I'm at home in myself, and the body becomes a resource and also a source of intelligence. We talk about somatic intelligence. And so the somatic intelligence, the emotional intelligence, are additional, to our brilliant minds.
Hmm. And I really love what you're sharing about embodiment, because I went from this pure disconnection of my body, and I love that you bring up the earth, because that's to me, like you said, the primary disconnection that we have is we're disconnected from the living body that gives us life. And part of my practice in the morning now is just to put my feet on the earth and remember that connection, because that just brings me right into grounding and into connection again, and gratefulness really for everything that the earth provides to us. That's something that a lot of us forget. And of course, we get busy, we do podcasts or whatever, and we just kind of get disconnected from that primary source of embodiment. So I really love that you share that. And on a societal level, I think that disconnection, like on the physical side to the planet, is causing us to create all these sort of harms in the way that we interface with that planet. So it's a very powerful um, line of a thread that we're weaving here today, and all the work that you've been doing on this is so rich, and we can touch on many things, but I'd like to bring it back to the first personal story you've had with movement. What was your first haha movement with somatics or embodiment or movement? Maybe it's at a festival someday, or like, what was the first moment you were like, oh wow, this is something powerful?
It's funny that you said festival, but it was something like that. I
Hmm.
grew up very academic in West Berlin, and, was definitely kind of on the mental path of understanding the world. And I was always athletic. But I was told that I was not a dancer, like I actually got asked to leave the ballet class because I wasn't graceful enough. And so I never considered myself a dancer. And then, grade 7, the awkward stepping from left to right, the shuffle at the first party. But then,
I
I
went through that
discovered,
as well. I
yeah,
went
you
through
did.
that
I
awkward
know,
shuffle. Yeah.
so awkward, right? And then, the close dancing, and I was like, wow, this is so interesting. Like in my heart, I knew I was a dancer because what I used to do was close my bedroom door because I had anxiety, to not be perfect at school and with my parents and all the social stuff that I was doing. I would close the door, turn on really loud music, and just let my body move. And I would like cry, I would stomp. So I knew deep down that movement was helping me to self regulate and release some of the stress. And then as I grew older, I discovered the Berlin underground scene, specifically the house and techno scene. So that was really my playground. And in some weird way, I was living that double life, like academia during the day and clubbing for probably at the height of it 3, 4 nights a week. And I found
Mm,
home in the beats. I think that was like that revelation that it's not just me, but it's a community that's coming together and we're aligning around. Techno beats are quite fast, but if you have a whole room, boom, 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 you're going into that, it creates that altered state for us together to be in. And I found those extremely healing. And I
mm,
would wake up and, discover parts of myself that otherwise weren't possible. And I wasn't even using psychedelics yet. That was
mm.
really just me and the beat and maybe a Red Bull.
Yeah.
So yeah, deep gratitude, for all those club DJs way back when, and just the wildness of people coming together, being themselves. There's an element of authenticity that this type
Mm.
of movement has brought me. And, that's always been my aim to share that it's not about a form or looking a certain way. It's about movement that is authentic, that comes from the depth of who you are.
That relates so much to that story. For me, it was the same experience in a club experience where I had this ha moment of togetherness with people dancing, and I had never felt that before. And it was very deeply healing and transformative for me, and not just from a collective connection point of view, but also about self acceptance, like you said, self expression. To be in a space where you can just be who you are and express yourself, and all is welcome within boundaries, of course, of ethics and things, but everything is welcome as to who you are and how you're showing up to this experience. And there's something about shared culture around rhythm, like that
Yeah.
transcends geographical location, backgrounds, cultures. All of that stuff is transcended through the beats, which, like you said, connects us to something deeper about our humanity.
Yeah. My teacher, Gabriel Roth, who is the founder of the Five Rhythms practice, that's my main practice that I'm offering. And I was lucky to study with her for 12 years until she passed. She would always say, rhythm is our mother tongue. and rhythm was there prior to spoken language. And, it's like in the simple things, in the drums, like people drumming together, or, women doing laundry or clapping together, or, men rowing together. So it doesn't necessarily always have to be in the dance, but there's something in our brains that actually syncs when we're in sync with each other through the beat. And it's very calming for our nervous system. And, I think the movement aspect, the dance, there's also a celebration here. And it can also be a healing opportunity. Many cultures have come together to share rhythm, to communicate, but also to heal. And that's something, having taught this body of work for so many years, that's what I see. People come to life from the inside, and there's something that happens in the spaces when we give people permission, to not dance to someone else's way of moving, but their way of moving, and to find their rhythm. We call it flowing, or their flow. And often we say trauma is a disruption of rhythm. And so to find one's true rhythm, and then to let your body move in that, and then possibly have other people witness that and mirror that for you. Wow. It's really rich.
Absolutely. And, from that first origin story of my experience of movement, it has evolved to a regular practice of ecstatic dance here in Bali. And it's such almost a religion here that people get together
Yeah.
and on
You're in the
Sundays
Mecca.
or
You're in the deep Mecca of the ecstatic
we're in the
dance
Mecca.
world.
Yeah, and so that experience of like being seen and reflected and seeing all the different styles of movement, and there's absolutely zero judgment in this space, is so healing. And I found that same uh, feeling of healing in integration circles with medicines, right? That feeling of being seen and heard without judgment, I think is
Yeah.
super powerful. And you don't need medicines even to experience that. Is that shared humanity? It brings
Yeah.
us into this space of rest and frequency and alignment, like you said, with our flow. And I find that's just powerful medicine. So um, how does this, and now I'm curious to talk about medicine work. How
Absolutely.
why does the body and embodiment matter in the psychedelic healing journey itself? And what does it mean to be in an embodied relationship with a psychedelic experience?
Hmm. Yeah. Wow.
It's a big question.
It's a big question. I'm just going to see where to start, because already earlier I mentioned, that we have to be at home here to experience anything, and that we're not seeking experience that are out there. And I think often there's that perception, especially in high doses of psychedelics, that we're leaving the body and we're experiencing somewhere else. But that's not the truth. We can only experience life in the body while we're on earth, through our senses,
Mm,
through our nervous system. And we might open our gates of perception to other ways of perceiving, which might be your imagination, your intuition, hearing things, feeling into things that feel otherworldly or not part of our day-to-day, consciousness. So we talk about the altered states of consciousness, but the vessel is still the body. And so what I know, as someone who has supported and guided medicine journeys, but also one who has taken very, very many on my own, is that the more connected I am and grounded in my body, the deeper I can go. And the more able I also am to co-create with the medicine. So,
mm,
very simple things can be noticing when I'm tightening and contracting the body because I'm scared, right? It's like what happens then, often the mind comes in, people have all these, moments of anxiety during the medicine journey. So the body here as a tool in the embodiment means that it's like, oh, I noticed that, and I can relax and trust and surrender and open again to the plant ally or psychedelic that I'm working with, as a simple example. The
hmm
other place that is really important is when we come out of the medicine experience, so that we actually have a place to come back to. And so somatic or body-based anchors are absolutely key, for us to have a stable experience of the body. It can be our connection to the earth. Right now you and I are both sitting. It's like even just like sinking a little deeper into your sits bones right now, right? It's like that, oh, here I am.
mm,
this is my earth anchor. So, again, we can come from that place of rooted and groundedness and then have deeper experiences.
Right. It's like being like a tree. You want the tree needs to ground into the earth to reach out into the heavens, right? Like it's kind of coming together in that way of the
Yeah,
ground being the foundation. And if we're
yeah,
dissociated from that, then it really limits the potentiality
yeah,
of these medicines. And like I said earlier, I came from a space of deep dissociation with my body, just completely in the head all the time. And it was
yeah.
only when I started to feel my body and accept my body, I think that's a big part of it, and attune to it during experiences that I really started to feel a lot more depth and a lot more learnings from my experiences, because I was actually present for it and not like it's so easy to get into the ethereal realms and just completely dissociate. So yeah, that can really limit the potential of these experiences.
Absolutely. And of course, sometimes we might want to explore the secrets of the universe, but we can do that from a place of solidity inside of ourselves, right? So that's the one side, body as a resource. The other part is body wisdom. Our soma holds intelligence, and I always say it's not just my own intelligence, but the wisdom of my ancestors. And I would go as far as to say my own past lives, they live in the soma. And so when I am in the psychedelic space, I can also pull up all that wisdom, and can
Mm,
bring it to conscious awareness. So then the body becomes a library and a resource in a different way. And then thirdly is the body as experiencing. And, a personal story that I want to share, here just to showcase what I mean with that is, one medicine journey, I, for literally 2 hours, constantly thought, I have to go to the bathroom. I have to go to the bathroom. I mean, how many times, can the mind say that? I have to go to the bathroom. I think my bladder is full. I might have to go to the bathroom. And then I was like, wait a minute, do I? And then, I actually attuned to my bladder and shifted attention down here and was like, what are you trying to tell me? What is going on here? And what was revealed, and this was like, my brain shifting into German because I was born there, was telling me all these like words for the bladder that is scared. And the bladder holds fear. And my bladder held a lot of fear. And so by hanging out with consciousness in my bladder, I was able to actually get underneath that constant urge to go pee, which had my past led to like UTIs and like you name it. And,
hmm
and I was like so grateful, for my body to actually aid me in the releasing of that deep seated fear, which was a
mm,
childhood memory that came up. And so it was a powerful reminder that my mind alone could have not moved forward. It
mm.
needed that connection, experiencing of the discomfort of the body and not seeing it as a bad thing, but this is information and let me investigate that.
And that curiosity about the wisdom library in the body is part curiosity and also trusting and honoring it and actually listening to it, right? It's a multi-part process that I've experienced. Is counterculture to the Western mind of using the brain to kind of solve everything, and we forget the gut and we forget the body and we forget all these other bodies you mentioned earlier. So I think it's a cultural thing as well that we're kind of walking, brains on sticks basically a lot of times, and that still happens to me as well. I'm not fully attuned or embodied yet, but it's definitely a cultural thing in the Western world.
Yeah. And it's a lifelong practice, right? Just because we're embodied once doesn't mean that we're going to be embodied tomorrow.
Absolutely not. Yeah, yeah, absolutely not. Yeah, and how can people tune into that intelligence more? What are ways that people can reconnect to that? Because I've experienced it. I'm sure you've experienced the same. It's like you said, a lifelong process of continuously coming back to the body. And for me personally, what's been really helpful is just really simple practices about attuning to the body and listening to it and taking care of it, and increasingly so developing a self-care practice and a self-love practice, and places of reminders like ecstatic dance that the body is super intelligent, and surrender the reins a little bit once in a while and experience what that feels.
Yeah. Yeah. The practices can be absolutely simple, as even just placing our hands on our body and just remind ourselves like, oh, I'm a feeling, sensing being, right? I can feel the hands on my body. I can feel my breath. I can feel my heartbeat. So beginning to make that connection between, what am I paying attention to? Because if I'm just stuck in we call it the chat room, if I'm just stuck here, um, that's great for moments of time, when I'm like really problem solving. But most of the time, I want to have access to all of myself and, use the body not just to carry my head around. And so it is a body mind connection that we're creating, and a lot of it has to do with learning to pay attention. So the practices that I offer usually start with a body part meditation, which is just, you inhabiting your hands. And it's like, oh, can I put my attention right now? And you can do that right now with me. Can I put my attention in my hands and actually notice them? Notice each finger. How do they feel inside? How do they want to move? Sending
Mm,
some breath and care, right? And so we do that, and then the mind can track what is alive in the hands. And then, the hands might do something, and you're like, what are you doing, hands? And it's like, oh, I'm being kind to myself. Oh, this is nice, right? And then the cheeks have a response. They might blush. So it is a conversation that we're essentially entering, with ourselves. And um, treating our moving bodies as intelligent. I think you said that, is that remembering, right? Is like this has its own intelligence, and a lot of it moves faster than we can think or feel, right? It's like that moment when you step into a room and your body has within milliseconds a
mm,
response, and you didn't plan that, you didn't feel into it. It's like it just happens, right? Or the going in, and that's what we're talking about. You can call it instinct, you can call it impulses, but the body communicates all the time. And so part of what we're doing is catching up to that, and
mm,
that it requires for a lot of us a retraining of what we pay attention to. So you could call it
mm.
meditation. Like Reggie Ray is one of my favorite meditation teachers. He's a Buddhist who talks about the awakening within the body. And he has a whole lot of great practices for the meditators out there.
I remember my first body scan meditation. Actually, was in Vancouver, where you're at right now. It was about 9, 10 years ago, and I remember just feeling into my knees, for example, and be like, I haven't felt my knees ever. I was like, what? Oh, I can feel my knees. It's amazing. Like I've never paid attention to my knees, for example. And nowadays, as I'm practicing paying more attention to all the parts, is sometimes I'll catch myself like being in the brain and like working, for example, which is where my brain really goes a lot of times, and just catching myself being completely disembodied with my body and just feeling actually highly uncomfortable. But I'm like holding this posture, whatever, when I'm working. But I pay attention more, and I think that's part of the process of opening up to these concepts. It's just to practice and catch yourself more and more, like you said. I think it's a very powerful and simple practice that you can start right now if you're
Yeah,
listening. Just like Bettina said, just feel your hands and see what happens. It's a bit of a magical discovery process, is what I found.
it is magical. And, to not only notice our body when we're hungry, tired, or in pain, because I think often our attention only begins to track our physicality when, one of these three components show up. And so I'm a big believer in pleasure and, like enjoying my physical experience, enjoying my senses, my sensuality, my interplay with life. But it also means I need to be present so that I can notice, the sound of the chimes and how they feel inside of my body. Or, right now here in BC, we have these incredible like roses coming up. Leela was actually just sharing her rose garden with me on Salt Spring, and we were smelling, and I was like, oh my God, I love being in my body and just experiencing that. Right. So part of it is also as a gateway into presence and anchoring ourselves into the sensing experience, the awareness of what is it like to be in this human vessel.
Yeah, it's about living every day as a ceremony, every moment as a gateway to our highest states, right? And within a psychedelic experience, I think a lot of us are, like you said, trying to reach the gates of heavens or something similar, and yet so much of the healing and the transformation can happen in the mundane quote unquote, if you're not seeing this on video, the mundane of the senses, and the little you know, ways that our senses are getting activated during a ceremony. How can people support themselves in continuously coming back to the body when so much of the ethereal, maybe mind spiritual things are blasting with full neon lights, and you can just be starry-eyed and stare at it for like 5 hours, or you can
Right.
come back to the body? But
Yeah.
how do you actually practice that in an actual tangible terms?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a bigger fan of psychedelics in nature than I am under neon lights, because it gives you that opportunity, right, to sit with the tree or to be by the river, and as you said, our senses are heightened, and oh wow, I remember a few times, being in those psychedelic states and just going like, wow, I know nothing. I'm just a dumb human. There's magic out here and an interconnection of everything that I don't understand, from here, but I can feel it in my body,
Mm,
and of course, I think certain psychedelics are more connective than others. Um, but the sheer enjoyment of looking, of seeing things, when you can see the matrix, when you can see, the energy body, let's say, of another being. Like, to me, that's what makes psychedelics so fascinating, because it enhances my experience of what it's like to be human, but a human in
mm,
connection. I think the neon light place is one place, where yes, we can have experiences, but I think there's also a danger there, in that kind of artificial world that we sometimes create, and take psychedelics more recreationally, and I do that as well, but I'm like more and more mindful of balancing that out with ceremonial experiences, and ways that actually really enhance my way of being in myself, rather than consuming, right?
hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And the neon lights I was referring to is the neon lights of the ethereal, because it's so attractive
Oh,
and
those ones. I thought you were
it
talking about
feels
like
like neon lights.
clubs, Burning
Yeah.
Man.
Well, I think there's a place for that. And also, I think it gives a completely different experience, but absolutely to what you shared about nature, I think is a very powerful reminder of connection. And once you see that, you can't put the rabbit back in the box. Like once you've seen that and felt and in the body that connection to all things, you can't unsee it. And I think one of my most powerful experiences have been with 5-MeO DMT, and those experiences were very body based for me. It was all about how much beauty and love can I actually accept in my body that's already available in the universe? How much of that can I actually integrate in my body? And that was a very physical experience for me of movement and letting go and de-stressing and releasing. And a lot got let go in my physical body. So we hold a lot of those stories and a lot of these misconceptions within our body and nervous system. And I think that's accumulated through, like you said, the soma and the generations before us. Can you speak a little bit more about that stored stuff inside our body?
Yeah, absolutely. One of my mentors, Thomas Hubel, he talks a lot about intergenerational trauma and how it's being passed down. Like in my family, both of my sides of the grandparents, they lived through both world wars, World War One, World War Two, in Germany. And you know, like many people after a war, they don't talk about anything, right? And the emotional, physical, and mental experience gets stored in their body somewhere. It gets like locked in. One of
Hmm.
my clients calls it the black box, creating this black box of stuff. And so what we know now is that that box, that stuff, gets passed down, as in like to my parents and then to us, as the next generation. Like, I'm the grandchild of those people that experienced two World War Twos, two World Wars, World War One and World War Two. Um, and so there's been a lot of studies done, from social kind of backgrounds and educational. It's like, who are these people? that are living as the grandchildren. And I just recently read a book. It was called in German, but I'll translate it for you. The grandchildren of the survivors, and it showed that we carry a lot of anxiety and a lot of distress that is not explainable, even though we have so much going on, of course, in our day to day as well. But it's like an existential angst that so many people carry, especially in Germany. And so, the author went as far to say is like, we are affected by what our grandparents did not process. And so I thought that's really interesting. And my own experience has certainly been that, that, and especially in the medicine space, I have memories coming up outside of my body somewhere that I know they're not mine. It's like my grandmother running away, with children on her hand and a suitcase. It's like, where's that coming from? She never told me those stories. So,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure. I'm not a neuroscientist, and epigenetics is a field that we're talking about as we can change our coding through this type of work that we're doing. I'm no expert on that. So my
Mm-hmm.
experience is more what I see within myself and what I see within the clients that I've been supporting. And there's strong evidence that if we're willing to turn towards the stories that have come through our ancestral lines, that in the here and the now, we can bring healing, not just to ourselves, but also to our ancestors. So
Mm-hmm.
one body of work that I have is called The Stories We Hold, and it works with the idea of somatic excavation. And so that excavation principle is, let's say, I have a right hip that's been sore my whole life. It's like, well, let's go in there. Let's see what's happening in there. And maybe it's a place that my mother also had as a pain point, and maybe my grandmother. And maybe there's something like an imprint. We talk about somatic body-based imprints that lives there, right? And so it's approaching our bodies with curiosity, but also kindness, and especially using pain or discomfort or tightness or places that are not inhabited, as information. I used to work a lot with women that were recovering from sexual abuse, and it's like there are certain parts of their body that are off limits. They don't go there in mind or touching or anything. And so, when you go deeper into those imprints, we can often see that those patterns are inherited. And some of it is conditioning, but my understanding is that there is an energetic imprint that we carry forward until it's resolved. And resolved means that there's no more charge. And that's the healing work, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's powerful. I can definitely trace back some of my own physical things to my dad and his father as well. And I have a friend who his ancestor was in World War One, and he was a night guard in some of the parts of the war. He was checking out, what's happening at night to stand guard for the other soldiers who were sleeping. And so my friend wakes up at night every night at 1 a.m. or so because he has this pattern of being a night watch basically, and I think that's very powerful. And what you shared about the way to get curious about that, again, we're talking about curiosity, like actually being curious. And then you also said kindness, which is something I'd love to bring up as well, is this concept of actually not using the body as a hammer or like a Abrams tank or like a Jeep or something. We just like use it. But there's, I think, a discovery of aspects of self-love, like when you were rubbing your cheeks there, like this aspect of actually loving ourselves and loving our body. In Ayurvedic medicine, there's a practice called Abhyanga, which is using
Yes.
black sesame oil to, massage yourself every night. And a lot of Indian people do that as a self-care practice. And when I started using that practice and practicing the practice, I found a lot of pieces of self-love that I was like, this is actually something that's very powerful and something that I can keep practicing. I think as a culture in general, we hold a lot of that body pain from our ancestors, and also the practice of loving ourselves, like truly practice. And that's very difficult for a lot of people. I've had a lot of body things in the past when I was bullied as a kid, and so I always had this like piece of I don't love my body or whatever. But these sort of practices have really changed my relationship to myself, and it goes very deep because once you love your body, your heart opens up, your relationship gets better, you show up in a better way. All these things blossom from that piece of self-love.
Yeah, absolutely. And you just brought in, I think, a really important piece too, and I think I have two daughters, they're 19 and 22 now. And both of them are really, really affected with their body image by the culture, especially social media and the conditioning of what a young woman has to look like. And I think we're really up against that as well as our own judgments and criticism of our physicality and, the suppression of impulses, right? It's like, I don't want to eat, so I suppress my hunger. Or, I can't be tired. I still have 5 hours to work. So we suppress being tired. And so there's over time, the body begins to not send those signals anymore, right? Or we numb out to them, as in like we don't even hear that anymore. So, part of that reclaiming is to learn to check in with ourselves is like, what do I need? And that is body, heart, and mind, and spirit. I usually say that's an important aspect too. It's like that wellness wheel of all four quadrants. And then if we wanted to add the social quadrant, because we are social beings, we could bring that in as well. What do I need in a social context? But it is a different way, as you said, of thinking about our bodies, not just to function, right, like a machine, but to care for it, like Mary Oliver says in her poem Wild Geese, letting the soft animal of our bodies love what they love. Like every time I get chills when I hear that, because it's like, yeah, we know what we love, if we're really honest with ourselves. And especially as women, we're up against the forever youth myth. And, the cyclical nature of being a woman is not really part of our work life. It's like that we have to be the same at all times, I think is also something that we're busting. And I certainly have seen that the psychedelic space, because people are not using their usual judgments and parts of their brain brings out another level of loving oneself. And that includes the body, just the magic, when you see people going like, oh my God, what's happening? Right? That miracle of life that pulses through us. I think even for that, to be in a medicine space, to really acknowledge what it means to be alive is
Mm,
one of the most potent places to be.
absolutely. And I remember one ceremony I had, it was just a men's group using Washuma, San Pedro, for those who don't know. And a big part of that ceremony was about reconnection to the animal, the wild part of our bodies. And at some point in the ceremony, we were all howling different animal sounds together. And it was so primal and so funny and so healing to be expressing that wildness and to embody that in the body, which is something that as floating brains and Jeep drivers, we sometimes forget that part of that wild part of our body, that wild expression of our body, and we suppress it in a lot of ways. Can you talk a little bit more about that wild side or that animal body that you mentioned earlier and how it relates to expression, authenticity, and reconnection to our humanness, really?
Yeah, absolutely. I sometimes think we're too over identified with our neocortex, which is like right here. It's like the most modern part of our brains. And we're like, we got a neocortex, we're so cool. We can
Woohoo!
plan, we can think our way through stuff. But underneath it is the reptilian brain, right? And it connects us more to those instincts that you're talking about and our emotionality and to our animal cells. And there's so much wisdom there, right? It's like to trust that. It's like
Mm,
sensing, there's a pressure change. It's like, whoa, something's happening, right? It's like a deer would do that. What's happening? And then boom, maybe a tree falls over. But it's like that understanding that, this vessel perceives faster than I can think, but it means that I have to be awake to it. And
mm,
not just hang out here, thinking about life, but I need to allow myself to experience life. And what you were talking about, kind of that wildness, that remembering, also reminds me of, cultural suppression of our primal force of sexuality, right?
No, that
Because
we could do a whole podcast of 10
that's all
hours on that
part
one.
of it. We
Yeah.
talk about pleasure, we haven't talked about sexuality. But if I cut myself off here and from that primal fire, right? It's like, yeah, I'm not, the church has done wonders to us in that separation of spirit, body, sexuality. And, it's like we're reclaiming our sexual nature here as well. And that primal part of ourselves that knows how to create, that knows how to defend ourselves, that knows how to move aggression through our bodies. Sometimes when we give people permission, and I don't know if that was your experience with the men and the Wachuma, people get really intense because it's like, holy shit, in that discovering, but that eventually settles, it's like, oh yeah, that's me too, but there's also, snake energy, and there's maybe the owl, it's like we can
Hmm.
connect to so many of our animal ancestors and relatives and, all kinds of kin through our body. And the memory
Hmm.
of that connects us to the wild. And to me, wild is life force. If
Yeah.
I'm used to contracting my life force or pushing it down, reclaiming that is like, can often feel like there's a lot coming up. And a lot of people get very scared, when suddenly
Hmm.
energy moves and they're like, oh my God, I'm feeling so sexual. I don't know what to do. Help.
Yeah,
And we
there's a
know that
culture.
that can happen in a psychedelic space, right? Is like that
Yeah.
unleashing of that force.
Yeah, there was definitely a very loud gorilla in the space that was really releasing a lot. I mean, there's a lot of suppression there for sure, and a lot of what you're talking about here is the relationship we have with ourselves and others, and the surface area between us and life itself, and how we're actually welcoming it, embracing it, letting it in, and trusting in life itself. And life itself is destruction and creation all the time, and it's a very creative process. It's continuously happening around us. And yet I think there's a part of us that wants to control that a little bit. Like, I know I've definitely had a sense of like wanting to control thing, and the tension comes from that, of like, no, it needs to be a certain way, and I can't fully open and surrender because I don't fully trust it. And I think that goes very deep in our psyche and our ancestors. And a lot of what you're sharing is about repatterning all that through little exercises or practices, or joining a group, or getting coaching, or opening up the the shell that we've been building around us slowly and slowly, and all of a sudden we're a more porous membrane where all this information can flow more fluidly, and magic can happen in that space.
Yeah. I like how you said, letting life in, and then you also used expression as in like, this is my response to life, right? And a very simple way, to even check in with oneself is our quality of the breath, because the
Mm,
inhale lets in and the exhale lets out. And that's the part of the expression. And, if we work with movement, it's like letting in and letting out. And for a lot of us, we stop the exhale. There's that containment, contraction, repression, depression. And that's, the opposite of that freedom and creativity. And it can lead, to all kinds of issues. It's like, long periods of time holding in, and especially if it's connected to true experiences, like I should be angry right now, but I'm holding it down, right? Someone just
mm,
stole my car, but no, I'm not going to let anything out. It's like we actually damage ourselves because we're not allowing the energy to move. And so part
right.
of what we're learning, in the five rhythms work, in breath work, and I think in some ways in the psychedelic space too, is to trust the movement of energy. And energy always moves in the same way. It's, we let it in, we need to enter somehow. And then once we've let in, we need to let out. It's like the yin goes into the yang, and then we let go. Only then
Mm,
can we let go. We cannot let go before we have let in or let out. And I think a lot of people say, oh, I just want to let it all go. But it's like, well, are you willing to let it in first and authentically express? And then you can let it go. And after the letting go is where the transformation begins, because new space opens up, right? And that
Hmm.
is the magical part where a lot of healing can occur.
I love that you say that because so much of the healing work isn't about turning away or letting go, like you said. It's about embracing what
Yeah,
is present in whatever way, shape, even if it's unpleasant or it's not exactly the way you want it. Uh, there's a lot of healing in letting it in and accepting, for example, the ancestral stuff that might be hurting your hip is like paying attention to it, accepting that it's there can be a big process for a lot of folks because there's pain involved or there's tension or there's a story that's quite charged. And so a lot of this medicine work is about, yeah, breathing in and letting go. And I think the letting go part is such a cultural thing as well around maybe our fear of death is that we're not able to let go of things because we're kind of holding on to life itself and not fully accepting
yeah.
death itself and our mortality really in this transient life that we live. And so a lot of what you're sharing is about living in the present moment, which I think comes with a lot of trust to be fully present to it.
Yeah, it is about that, and it goes even further. It's me taking responsibility for my own energy being, right? And knowing that I'm the medicine person. I don't need to take medicine, but I can move energy. I can do that simply by paying attention. I can let in, I can let out, I can let go, and I can trust that process of transformation happening when I have done those things. And to me, that's a path of empowerment and, a path that takes us away from I need a therapist, I need a guru, I need all those things. Of course we need support, but I'm much more of a fan, of saying, I'm here with you, I'm your guide, I'm your, person to hold the space with you and show you these tools, but you need to do the work. And it's so empowering for people. It's like, I read a sign once, somebody came to the chiropractor and at the chiropractor was a sign. It's like, don't leave your responsibility at the door, bring it in with you. And I think we do that, right? It's like, just fix me, right? Or we go to a therapist, just take my pain away. But there's that piece of going, like, as you said, acceptance. It's like, ow, I'm moving with pain today. Can I really let that in? And in that acknowledgement, something already happens in the body mind because I'm no longer overriding. I'm no longer resisting. I'm no longer pretending or avoiding, right? It's
Mm,
like I'm with myself, and then that pain can inform me, and there might be an expression, even if it's just ouch, ouch, ouch. But if I do that enough, letting in, letting out, it will change. And that's the
mm,
magic of it all, right? It's not a status quo because it's movement. But then energy stagnates when we're stuck or frozen or not willing to go there. That's when we have those like, well, nothing will ever change moments, right? It's like we're
mm,
keeping it in the status quo. And so the most powerful thing we can do is inhale, believe it or not, like fully inhale, like really let in our experience and then letting the exhale happen, with a lot of permission, just going like, let's see what happens. Right. And it
yeah.
involves trusting ourselves or trusting the containers that we're choosing because we don't know what's going to come out with an exhale. What our
Yeah, it's a
truth
lot.
actually is.
Yeah, it's a powerful practice. And Robin, which you know already, is a very strong proponent of, your the quality of your life is reflected in your breath.
Yes,
Basically.
absolutely.
Yeah, and the
Absolutely.
exhale is a big part of the trust and surrender, and the inhale is all about energy and letting it in. And there was a couple of authors you mentioned in our previous conversation, which is Gabriel Roth and Bessel van der Kolk. Apologies if I
Yeah.
don't. And
Yeah.
they said that the body does not lie and that our bodies keep the score. And so I'm curious about fleshing that out a little bit more, but also what are the signs that someone's body is revealing a deeper truth that the mind may have suppressed? Like, what are ways to pick up on those things?
Well, our bodies are always communicating. It's just up to us to dial into the channel to actually notice, right?
Mm,
So, Gabriel Roth said the body doesn't lie. And that just means that there's an element of authenticity, when we're not overriding what's happening, but just like by acknowledging someone's posture, right? I mean, if you're sitting in my program like this and you're putting a fake smile on, I'm not going to buy it, because I can see the resistance in you and the holding of the belly, the holding of the ground, right? And so I get curious about that, when we're not presenting congruently. Our body's really honest with moving towards, if I'm curious or interested in something, or something feels safe, or, I'm moving away when it doesn't. And so we're learning to pay attention to that, that like deep seated wisdom of the soma that, I think everybody that I've worked with can wake up to quite easily, because you just need to look at yourself in the mirror.
That's
Right.
right.
And like, what am I seeing right now? Right. And in my case, when I'm anxious, it's like my shoulders are up, my chest contracts, my eyes get really big. I'm like, oh, honey, you're scared. Okay. And it's, so I can take that as information, how I connect with myself, but also how I connect with others.
Mm,
Like when I see my kids and I watch their body language, there's so much that they're revealing, even though they might say very little. So
mm,
it's another way that we can learn from each other in that nonverbal communication. We say that probably 75%, I mean, statistics vary, of all communication is nonverbal. And so that means that we learn to pay attention to those cues, not just for ourselves, but for our relations. The
mhm.
second author that you brought up is Bessel van der Kolk, and he is an interesting man. I studied with him a little bit. He is foundational in the mental health world, and acknowledging that trauma is the root cause for a lot of our conditions. And, he worked with Harvard and many, many brilliant minds, as a psychiatrist, as a doctor, really pointing towards that the body, if we experience trauma, keeps that trauma stored. Gabor Mate is another one who works with that concept, when the body says no. And so that understanding is that, unless we find the root cause, which often lives in the body as a gestalt, to bring in a psychology term, as something that hasn't resolved itself, right? As an imprint that remains, that over top we can, potentially have all kinds of behavioral or mental or emotional problems, but that's actually not the problem itself. It's what lives underneath it. And so Bethel was and is very instrumental in bringing awareness to early childhood trauma and
Mhm.
the truth of trauma.
And that's very powerful and deep work. And a lot of insights and wisdom come from getting curious once again about what's living there. And we've talked a lot about the bodies as providing a gateway for change and transformation. And I'd like to shift as we're closing here soon. How does this work start impacting people? Like, let's say I'm starting to develop a somatic practice, I'm starting to pay attention, I'm getting curious. How does it change our relationships, and how does it change our life? And how do we know that healing is taking root when we're starting to explore these things? And what changes when we start to do this work that you've been teaching for many years now?
You always ask big question, Pascal. This is our closing question. Okay, so what I will say, I've been holding spaces, for over 25 years, and I will just tell you what I see when people start and what I see over time. I often see people coming into the spaces being primarily here, as in like thinkers, observers. There's an element of self-judgment, self-consciousness, maybe stories. And then they kind of get into the body. And often it's not a pleasant experience right away, right? Because we suddenly begin to notice, ow, I actually have back pain. And actually my digestion is off. So it's not like healing is always pleasurable, but what we build is capacity to tolerate and be with, and not just tolerate, but find that what we talked about, self-love and acceptance. It's like, oh, my body is going through something, or I'm actually tired, I need to go rest, right? So when we begin to do that cycle of tending and, using embodiment practices, which doesn't just have to be conscious dance. It, can be breath, it can be yoga, it can be running, it can be Tai Chi, it can be all kinds of things. But I say the components here are, learning to pay attention and being mindful, and moving your body with that mindfulness in mind, which often includes a mindfulness of breath, mindfulness of space, and a mindfulness of connection to other. We become more whole, back to how we started. We suddenly begin to feel like there's more of us there.
Hmm.
And we're maybe more present, not just to ourselves, but to others and life. And the other thing that goes up over time, is the sense of aliveness. People actually looking more alive, feeling more alive. There's more energy available.
Hmm.
Um, and over time, the experience of pleasure, of holy shit, I'm embodied, goes up. And it's not the
Hmm.
same path for everyone, obviously. But just from what I've seen, there's an increase in mobility. People tend to look younger even because of how they move. When we free ourselves of these patterns that most of the time have elements of contraction and holding, and we liberate and become fluid and spacious, is like, our movement also connects us to that youthfulness that the Taoists talk about, the
Hmm.
chi flow that is accessible to us. So those are just a few pieces. And, I think also just the fun of what it's like to be in a body and not to be limited, by our perception of it. Because I think for most of us, it's probably true that we limit ourselves in identity. Well, I'm not a dancer. I'm not this. I'm not that. And the dance, same as the psychedelic space, really invites us to grow beyond that and, connect with something that's bigger than us. And I find it in the dance, I find it on
Hmm.
the mat, in the breath, I find it in the psychedelic journey. It's like understanding that my small persona is just an aspect of me. And of course, it's an important one. And that's the one that, I'm relating with most of the time, but I have access to so much more. And then, the mystery comes through the vessel of the body. It's like, wow, here I am. I'm
Hmm.
seeing, I'm sensing, I'm seeing you. So
Hmm.
an element, maybe you can call it wonder and play and fun, I
Yes.
think is
I found
also,
that the more healing work you do, the more wonder, play, and fun comes in and reminds us of the fact that we're on a rock in space floating around. And it's a freaking miracle that we exist. And if you just look at a flower or the eyes of a loved one or a child or, name it, it's just miracles abound around us. And that's what my 5-MeO experience was,
yeah.
plugging into my body, and there's been this spark of joy ever since because I just appreciate the miracle. And of course, it's not that I bypass all the unpleasant things, but there's a resource that's always there and present. That's the truth, and I know it, and I felt it in my body. um, and so, yeah, thank you so much for the work you're doing. And I'm really excited for the online group experience you're going to be hosting at Nectar next week. Can you share a little bit more about that? And hopefully we can do regular ones, because I think movement is such a powerful gateway. And yeah, just thank you for all the work and for being on the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you, Pascal, and thank you to all of you at Nectara. It's such an important platform to have, and to be sharing these resources as we're all, I think, on this path of expansion of consciousness, of our ability to impact. That's a whole nother part of I think the psychedelic space that I'm passionate about is what do we do with our experiences. But yes, we're doing the life circle, and it will include movement practices, really, looking at some simple tools through body, breath, and movement that we can use as anchors for our psychedelic experiences, but not obviously just in that space. I usually recommend daily somatic practices, even if it's just 5 minutes, to begin that training of body and mind, and to develop our understanding of our own ability to move energy. So we will go through the 5 rhythms as a vessel, as a vehicle, to move energy in the live call next Thursday. And
Beautiful.
that's
Can you share?
Thursday PST time. Yeah.
Perfect. And can you share just a little bit about the five rhythms
Yeah.
framework and the basics of it?
Absolutely. So, Five Rhythms is a embodied spirituality. Gabrielle Roth, who we mentioned earlier, was the founder of it, and her whole approach was how do we bring spirit back into the body? How do we become embodied beings that have a heart, that have a mind, where everything works together? And she found such extreme disconnection from the body. She lived and worked at Esalen Institute together with Fritz Perls, who was the founder of Gestalt psychology and the father of psychology in many ways. And he said, "You have to help me, Gabrielle." I was like, all my groups, they just want to talk, 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 think, think, think. And, she got people moving. And when you get the body moving, the psyche begins to open itself. And then people started feeling. And she was like, oh my God, what are we going to do with all these emotions now? Right. So she began to build these medicine maps. And we call them medicine because we believe here that movement is the medicine. And so the five rhythms, is a medicine map in itself. And it is designed to wake up the medicine person inside of ourselves. And it is also designed to move ourselves back into wholeness and alignment bit by bit. And, the classes are a lot of fun. We do them all over the world, and every community has their own flavor. I've been doing it for a very long time, and I travel extensively to teach this work. And it can look just like you said, ecstatic dance. There's a DJ and people are rocking out. And it can look like really deep, deep, deep soul work. And I was just on Salt Spring Island with 80 other people, going through this deep container. And it's like, when you put the psyche in motion, and not just me, but in community, also the relational web becomes really visible. Am I able to look into your eyes and be present? As
Hmm.
simple as that.
Yeah.
Still notice my own breathing and my own feet. For some people, that's like, I don't even know what I'm doing here. So there's a learning also how to be together in community, how to be embodied, how to care about each other,
Mm.
how to show up. So
Yeah.
it's not a practice that is just done in isolation.
Yeah. Beautiful. Can't wait. So excited. Thank you so much.
You're
And
so
yeah,
welcome.
to everyone else out there, try moving, feel into your body, whatever feels right. But yeah, there's a lot of richness waiting for us
Yeah,
in that
honestly,
space.
the best thing to do is just find your favorite piece of music and just rock out in your kitchen. It doesn't have to be a specialist spiritual thing. And I think
Yeah.
often people have this, I have to get a studio, I have to have the right clothes. It's like, no, you could be you in your bathrobe, dancing to your favorite new house track. I mean, that's me, I'm a house DJ, like whatever it is, but it's that willingness to move the body and not just the head, but use your whole vessel because it's fun.
Yeah. Have fun. Exactly. Yeah. Thank you so much, Bettina. Be well. And thank you so much for being
Yes,
here.
you're so welcome. Until our next time. Bye,
Yeah.
Pascal.
Bye.